What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the ebbs and the flows of a garden, the changes that a garden will see throughout the course of a season, and how to maximize those changes so that you're harvesting the most amount of food from your garden space and keeping your soil covered for most of the season. This is something we stress all the time because I think a lot of gardeners assume their garden is like a light switch. A garden is not on and off. A garden is always changing, it's always in flux, and there's always something that's happening in a garden, or at least there should be if you're gardening correctly. You know, a lot of gardeners, they just want to plant their main season stuff, and then they either let their beds sit for the rest of the season completely empty, which is a terrible option because sun just scorches and beats down on your soil, ruining your soil health, or there's rains in early season that just flood your beds, wipe them free of nutrients, and then when the main season comes, you have terrible quality plants because the nutrients are gone, the soil health is gone, the soil texture is gone, and you've really ruined your garden as a whole just because you're picking out one main season to grow. I mean, sure, everyone has their favorite seasons. My favorite season is spring, but I still love tomatoes, don't get me wrong, you know? I love growing lettuce in the spring, but I do look forward to growing peppers in summer. You know, every season is wonderful and every season has its pros and cons, but you still have your favorite seasons and that's fine, but you need to realize that just because you have your favorite seasons doesn't mean you can neglect all the rest. So again, I want to reiterate, a garden is not like a light switch. It is not on and it's not off. It is always in flux. The first type of bed is the seasonal bed. This is the most common type of bed that us as gardeners plant because it's the most easy to understand. You know, you have warm weather crops and you have cool weather crops. You have fall crops, you have spring crops, you have summer crops. There's a lot of different types of crops, but we can understand that a tomato loves warm weather, and we can understand that radishes and really short season stuff like arugula and spinach are cold weather crops. So what we want to do in a seasonal bed is plant the seasons. It's very simple. You know, for this bed here, we planted spinach in the beginning, and then we planted tomatoes, and then when it's all done, when the tomatoes are done in the end of the season, we'll plant radishes. This ensures that we get 3 different crops in this bed when most gardeners only get 1. You know, I think a lot of gardeners just wait until the warm season comes and plant their tomatoes. Let me know if you do that because I know I'm not alone. I used to do that all the time where I'd literally just wait for a bed to come into season so I could plant it. There should always be something planted in the bed space, even if it's seasonal. Because the fact of the matter is that tomatoes, they really don't do well in cold weather. They're very prone to blight, they're very prone to powdery mildew, and they're very prone to blossom end rot because there's not really good pollination going on in the garden when seasons are cold because there's not a whole lot of pollinators out in really late season or really early season. So what we want to do as gardeners is maximize that space. Plant 2 short season crops and a long season crop in a seasonal bed. The next type of bed are our perennial beds. Now these see the least amount of changeover in our entire garden because of the fact that they're perennials. They come back year after year, so we can't really move them around a lot. And they stay in the bed. They do have their seasons. These are June-bearing strawberries, so they'll produce strawberries in June. And then it's pretty much just foliage for the rest of the year. So we don't really change these beds out on a yearly basis, but they do see an ebb and a flow because after about 3 years, what we have to do is pull all the plants up, put compost back in, top the beds off, remineralize, and then thin out the amount of plants because right now the plants are so dense, they're so thick that they're competing for space, they're choking out airflow, and they're also competing for nutrients as well, meaning that the production in these beds are actually relatively low compared to what they could be. So these beds even will see some changeover, just not as much as your seasonal beds that are just rapid fire succession, changing things out based on the seasons. These you base on their lifespan. So these will also see an ebb and a flow. However, we will also plant the same plants right back in their space. So once we fill up the beds with compost, we'll just pick out the healthiest strawberries or use runners to restart these beds, and we'll still have strawberries in these 2 beds, but there will be some change. So just keep in mind of that. This also applies to things like perennial herbs or blackberries, raspberries, gooseberries, blueberries, any type of perennial that you're planting. It could even be perennial flowers. They're by far the least amount of maintenance, but they will still have some maintenance. Keep that in mind. The next type of bed are our quick succession beds. These are beds that are rapid fire succession and we're getting a ton of turnover in a bed. These are beds that typically take about 30 to 50 days for maturity time, so that in a given bed, we can plant 3 to 5 different crops in a given season. We might plant an early season harvest of radishes, then we might transition that into arugula. Then from arugula, we might move into beets, and then from beets, we might move back into arugula, or we might transition to something cooler like spinach and radishes. So you have about 3 to 5 different crops that are growing there, and they're very quick. And that's because the seasons are so quick. We might even do something like beans in early season, beets in the summer season, and then radishes or spinach for the fall season. So those are 3 crops that you're going to plant, but you're transitioning things out very quickly. The other way you might do it is you might plant beets in super early season, beets in the summer season, and then beets in the fall season. Depending on your area, depending on how much season you have, in our area this is possible. We just have to harvest smaller beets rather than letting them sit in the garden for 60 to 75 days. We're going to harvest them after 45 to 50 days when they're about the size of a golf ball. They're smaller size, but we're able to rotate those crops out much quicker and get even more succession out of our beds. So that's what we call a quick succession bed. It's beds that have a relatively small growing period over the course of a longer growing season, equaling many different changeouts. All right, let's go to the next one. The next type of bed that we're going to plant are biseasonal beds. These are beds that require you to plant the year prior for a harvest this year. These are things like garlic. We plant garlic in October of the year prior, so we can harvest in early to mid-July of this year. Once we pull those plants out, there's quite a lot of bed space left that's not being utilized, and we're kind of left with a dilemma. It's too early in the season to plant cold weather crops like spinach and radishes. They'll just go to bolt. We can't really plant things like lettuce because it's still pretty hot for that. So what do we plant? Well, I recommend planting some of your longer maturing fall crops. As much as we don't like to think about fall in the middle of summer, it is coming and it's something you want to plan for. Plant things like cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli. These are crops that are going to grow in the heat and are going to actually mature as the weather gets cooler, meaning they're going to have a longer growing season overall, but you're actually going to have better success with head production, and the plants are going to actually prefer it because rather than getting warmer really quickly in the spring, it's actually going to get cooler slower in the fall, meaning they're going to grow a little more consistently. So these are beds that will actually have seasonal turnover in the sense that we'll only be able to plant about 2 crops because one is a biseasonal crop that requires October to July, and then we'll plant one like August till November. And that way you'll have 2 crops that are both pretty long season, but they kind of overlap seasons so that you're never going to plant garlic in the same bed, because if you do, there really won't be a good transitional period in between. So garlic will just move over to another bed later on that we'll have for a fall planting, and then that way it'll be a summer harvest for the next year. And then we'll do the same thing with that bed. We'll plant a longer season crop there that will grow into the fall in that bed, and then we'll just transition it over, and it kind of just becomes like popcorn, moving this bed, moving the garlic bed around, because it does kind of overlap those seasons. So that's the next bed type. Now let's move on to the final bed type, which is one that I don't think a lot of people really talk about that often. And the final bed type that we have is an interseasonal bed. This is a hybrid between 2 or more bed types. So we have perennial hyssop. This is a flower that we grow for an herb, but it also attracts a lot of pollinators. It does flower all season long, but it doesn't take up a whole lot of space, and so we have to leave this here because it is a perennial. But what do we do with the rest of the bed space? Well, we treat it just like a regular bed, with transitioning in spring and summer crops. We planted radishes and spinach here in early season, as well as mustard greens. Those are a really quick season crop, but then we transitioned that into peppers, which are more of a long season grow. You plant them in early spring, and you pretty much grow them all summer long until the first frost. So we planted peppers here, but we did get that kind of cyclical transition from spring to summer crops, as well as combining that with perennial crops. This is a great way to maximize space in your garden and still plant a lot of biodiversity that might have overlapping seasons. You can still have them coexist within the same bed. So these are all the bed types that we implement here in the garden, and I recommend you guys try them. They're so much fun, and they really allow you to grow the most amount of plants because there's never a time when we're not growing something. And that's one of the biggest things a lot of people have noticed about a garden is they say, Luke, you're always growing something. How do you do that? That's really how. We just look at what we're planting, we look at the season of what we're planting, and we actually do this in like late winter before we plant a single plant in the garden. When we're planning everything out, we plan out which beds are going to be seasonal beds. We plan out which beds are going to be quick rotation beds. We plan out which beds are going to be perennial beds, and we also plan out which beds are going to be hybrid beds or interseasonal beds. It is really an easy way to maximize production in the garden, making sure that your soil is covered, and also making sure that, that your garden is always looking beautiful, first and foremost. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. As always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel reminding you to grow big or go home. Let me know what type of bed styles you do in the comments box below, and we'll catch you all later. See ya.